Folds of Honor Repair, Part 4. Let's finish this fender up. So we're going to begin with getting ready to spray the blue onto this front fender. Before we can do that, we need to mask off the border and then also mask off the stars. The existing border on these parts that the original artist put into place is a little bit of an odd size. It's a little less than 1/8 of an inch, and I don't have a tape size that corresponds with the exact width that the original artist used. So what I'm going to do is very similar to what we did in part 2 when we were masking off this silver section of the fender. I'm going to go back to my Creative Custom vinyl fine line tape, and I'm going to tape off the border on the inside first. Again, the size of this border is a little abnormal. It's less than 1/8 of an inch and it's more than 1/16. So basically, I'm just guesstimating the size of the border at this point. So from this point, I can apply another piece of tape adjacent to that first piece of tape and then remove that first strip of tape, and then I'll have the border masked off. And it's important to take your time while you're doing this. Make sure you get it exactly the way you want it. With the border masked off, we can move on to masking off each of the stars. You'll notice I've got my reference pictures put back up so that I can remember the general layout where all of these stars existed previously. You could put some transfer tape down on this, draw each of these stars out, and then cut them out individually. That's the way we actually did it years ago before we had vinyl cutters. I chose to draw out stars the same size as the originals were in my computer software, and then I cut a bunch of them out on my vinyl plotter because it's just faster. It's still a little bit of an arduous process because I'm going to put each of these onto the fender individually, but it still turns out to be a little bit faster than drawing them out and then cutting them out by hand with a razor blade or an X-Acto knife. So we'll begin that process now. probably noticed that I'm not actually burnishing any of these down at this point. That's because I want to wait till I get the layout, at least the first line laid out, and make sure that they all fit where they're supposed to fit before I actually burnish them down. Because if I need to move something at this point, it's a lot easier to move it before you actually burnish those down. Perfect example of what I was just talking about. As I got this first line laid out, I wasn't happy with the spacing and the way they all fit in the space, so I'm going back and rearranging the gaps between these stars at this point. Now, is that the exact same layout as the stars were previously? No, but it's very close to the way that they were before, and it's probably about as close as I can get it just eyeballing it without spending just an enormous amount of time really trying to get them perfect. So at this point, I will mask off everything that needs to be protected while we spray the blue. So take a little break and we'll pick it up from there in just a few minutes. All right, I've got the fender masked off and I've already mixed up my paint. It's AutoAir Pearlized Blue straight out of the bottle. I've mixed it 1 part Pearlized Blue, 1 part UVLS, and 1 part 4011 reducer. Because we're shooting a pearl, I'm going to use my Iwata HPTH. The fan pattern helps to get a better, more even coverage. So I'll kick on the fans and we'll get to spraying. This is a really nice color of blue. I like it a lot. Unfortunately, it doesn't match the rest of the blue on these motorcycle tins. To do that, now I need to come in with a couple coats of AutoAir Sparklescent Nightmare Blue 2. It's more on the violet side, and that's what's going to flip this color to match the existing blue. So this has had about 10-15 minutes to sit, so we're ready for some Sparklescent Nightmare Blue 2. This was mixed the exact same way that I mixed the pearlized blue. It's 1 part Sparklescent, 1 part UVLS, and 1 part of 4011 reducer. Again, I'll be using the TH airbrush to get even coverage. Once the blue was sprayed, then I unmasked everything and I went back to the same step that I used after I had painted the red and the white stripes. I sprayed a couple coats of UVLS Gloss Clear over the entire fender this time. Again, that's for 1, to protect the artwork that I have done, and 2, to knock down the taped edges around the stars and this blue color. The reason I'm not showing you guys that on camera is because I'm actually using a minigun to spray the UVLS Gloss Clear, so I'm not doing that in the studio. Once the UVLS gloss had cured for about 2 hours, then I came over the top of it again with 600 grit dry sandpaper to knock down those taped edges around the stars and the blue color on this fender. The rest of the fender was just scuffed lightly with a red Scotch-Brite pad. As far as this blue is concerned, I can tell that the original artist painted these parts separately at least part of the time. One reason I can tell that is the highlights on the fender are a lot more substantial compared to the tank. The tank, the highlights are very muted. They're not near as bright and as thick as they are on this front fender. The other thing that I noticed is this blue color that I sprayed is actually a little bit darker compared to the existing blue on the back side of the fender. Under the sunlight, they glow pretty close to the same color, but under artificial light, the color that I sprayed is actually a little bit darker compared to the color that is pre-existing on the fender. I think I'll be able to, again, mask some of that by adding the shadows and the highlights. We'll just have to wait and see. So the next step in the process is to add those shadows and highlights. Another thing you might be wondering is, why am I doing this working back and forth? Rather than spraying the red and white stripes and then the blue and the silver and then working on the shadows and highlights, that's the way I would normally do it. I would knock everything out, the shadows and the highlights out in the end. In this case, I wanted to make sure that I could blend the white and the red into the existing colors. That's why I went ahead and did the shadows and the highlights before I painted the blue. Another thing I noticed on the existing blue and silver stars is the original artist actually shaded a lot over the border around that blue color. So in this case, it works a little bit better to come in later and do the shadows and the highlights over the blue after I've already done the shadows and the highlights on the red and white stripes. So the next step, I'll put some of the transparent black mixture that we used in the last video to do the shading on the red and the white stripes. We're going to use the same mixture to do the shading and the same mixture with the transparent white to do the highlights over these stars. And that's what pretty much goes into a repair like this. That's the process that I used anyway. There are other ways that you could tackle this. That's just the way that I chose to do this particular repair. And overall, I'm happy with the way it turned out. I've already put a clear coat on it. Here it is out in the sun. And overall, I'm pleased with the way it came out. Again, it's a little bit darker on the front fender than I would have liked. But looking at it, I can't tell that the paint on the front half of this fender is different or has been redone compared to the back half of the fender. It turned out nice. The blue is a little bit darker than the back side of the fender, but it actually matches the tank pretty well. So overall, I'm happy. One thing to note that I didn't mention before, I talked about using the UVLS Gloss Clear in order to minimize your masked edges when you have a paint buildup along taped edges or vinyl edges, whatever the case may be. It's a great solution to minimizing those edges, but be aware that anytime you start sanding your paint, you are removing paint. So make sure that you have enough coats before you start sanding on it so that you do not sand into your base coat and wind up having to repair your own work. In some cases, it might be better to err on the side of caution, put 3 good coats of UVLS Gloss Clear onto the project that you're working on, allow that to cure, then sand it lightly with a 600 grit, and then come back in and repeat that process once again in order to really eliminate those masked edges, just to make sure that you don't go through to your base coat, because repairing your own mistakes is never fun. So that pretty much wraps up the repair portion of this series. I've already been working on the tank off camera. I've done it off camera simply because it's the exact same process, other than the fact that I reverted back to the original Autoborn Sealer custom mixed white base coat for the tank, and I darkened up the red mixture just a little bit, and the tank is turning out well. Here's a quick pick. But other than adjusting those 2 colors compared to what I did on the front fender, the process is exactly the same as what I did on the fender. So, and the final installment of this series will look at actually applying the logo to the fuel tank. So until then, I hope you guys have got something out of these videos. If you did, remember to like, subscribe, and share. I'm Trevor with Wicked Art Studio, and I'll see you guys next week.